On the morning of June 6, 1816, a farmer in Vermont walked out to check his corn and found it stiff with frost. Not autumn frost, not a late spring cold snap. This was June. By afternoon it was snowing, 6 inches of it in the first week of summer. His sheep froze where they stood, and the strangest part is that he had no idea why. No one in New England did. No one in Europe did. The cold had arrived without a cause, and it would not leave for a year. They called it 1800 and froze to death. What that Vermont farmer could not have known, what almost no one on Earth understood for another century, is that the thing killing his crops had happened 11 months earlier and 8,000 miles away on an island most of them had never heard of. The mountain was called Tambora. It stands on Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia. In April of 1815, it was a quiet volcano roughly 14,000 feet tall, with 3 small kingdoms farming rice on its lower slopes. On the evening of April 10th, it detonated, not erupted, detonated. The explosion tore the top off the mountain, removing nearly 5,000 feet of solid rock in a matter of hours. The sound of it was heard in Sumatra, more than 1,600 miles away. Soldiers there assumed it was cannon fire and marched out expecting a battle. There was no battle. There was only the mountain coming apart. Columns of ash rose more than 25 miles to the sky, pyroclastic flows, avalanches of gas and rock moving faster than a train, hot enough to turn stone soft, poured down the slopes and into the sea, where they raised tsunamis. The 3 kingdoms on the mountain's flanks simply ceased to exist. Their fields, their houses, their people buried under meters of ash in a single night. An entire language died there. The Tambora tongue, unrelated to anything spoken around it, gone before anyone thought to write it down. Around 10 to 12,000 people were killed by the eruption itself. But that was only the beginning of the arithmetic. And then came the dark. The ash cloud spread outward for hundreds of miles, and for 2 days the region around the mountain was plunged into total blackness. Not the dimness of a storm, but a darkness so complete that people could not see their own hands at noon. Ash fell like gray snow across the islands, collapsing roofs under its weight and poisoning the wells. On Sumbawa the rice crop was buried, and in the months that followed, famine and disease killed tens of thousands more. The survivors of the blast dying slowly in the silence after it. And here is what is stranger. The most dangerous thing Tambora produced was not the fire or the ash or the dark. It was something you could not have seen at all. When the mountain exploded, it threw somewhere between 37 and 45 cubic kilometers of rock into the atmosphere. The largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, 4 times the size of Krakatoa, roughly 100 times the blast of Mount St. Helens. Most of that fell back to Earth as ash, but a portion of it was sulfur. Millions of tons of sulfur dioxide punched high into the stratosphere, above the weather, above the rain that would otherwise have washed it out. Up there, the sulfur reacted with water vapor and formed a fine haze of sulfate droplets. And that haze did something very simple and very terrible. It reflected sunlight. A thin veil spread by high-altitude winds until it wrapped the entire planet, quietly turning away a fraction of the sun's warmth before it could reach the ground. You could not see it. You could only feel the cold it left behind. The following spring, the veil arrived over Europe and North America. Global temperatures fell by around 1 degree Celsius, which sounds small, until you understand that a single degree, held across an entire growing season, is the difference between a harvest and a famine. In New England, the frost came in every month of 1816. In July and August, ice formed on ponds as far south as Connecticut. Farmers replanted their crops 3-4 times and watched each one die. In Europe, it rained without stopping. That summer at Lake Geneva was so cold and dark that a group of English writers trapped indoors held a contest to pass the time. One of them was a 19-year-old named Mary Shelley. The story she wrote in that sunless summer was Frankenstein. The monster, it turns out, was born from the weather, but the writers were the lucky ones. They were only bored. Across Europe, the grain simply did not grow. Bread prices doubled, then tripled. In France and Switzerland and the German states, crowds looted bakeries and burned grain barges. It became the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world, the final time that Europeans starved in large numbers because the sky itself had failed them. In Ireland, the cold and wet brought a typhus epidemic that killed tens of thousands. In Switzerland, the government declared a national emergency. And here the story turns, because the cold did something no one connects to a volcano. In the German state of Baden, a young inventor named Karl Dreiss watched the famine kill the horses, animals that could not be fed when the oats failed. He began to wonder whether a person might travel without one. In 1817, in the depths of the aftermath, he built a 2-wheeled wooden machine you pushed along with your feet. It was called the Draisine. It was the ancestor of the bicycle. The bicycle was invented in part because a volcano in Indonesia starved the horses of Europe. What if this is the real lesson of Tambora? That the largest events in human history do not always announce themselves. That a mountain can fall on the other side of the world, and the consequence arrives at your door disguised as weather, as a bread price, as an invention, as a novel, with no name attached to it at all. Because the reach of it was almost unbelievable. In the Bay of Bengal, the disrupted monsoon of 1816 and 1817 is thought to have altered the ecology of the Ganges Delta. And it was there, in exactly those years, that a new and far deadlier strain of cholera emerged. That strain would travel the world's trade routes and become the first global cholera pandemic, eventually killing far more people than the eruption ever did. In Yunnan, in southwestern China, 3 straight years of failed rice harvest produced a famine so severe that farmers tore out their fields and planted opium instead. A crop that could survive the cold and that would reshape the region for a century. One mountain, and its shadow fell on a Vermont cornfield, a Geneva drawing room, a German workshop, a Bengal riverbank, and a Chinese hillside. None of them aware of the others, none of them aware of the mountain. For 100 years, no one drew the line. The connection between Tambora and the year without a summer was not firmly established until the 20th century, when scientists learned to read the sulfur layers frozen into the ice of Greenland and Antarctica. A chemical diary of every great eruption written in the ice, waiting to be read. Only then could they hold the mountain and the frost in the same hand and say, these were the same event. Which leaves us with the uncomfortable part. We now know that the sky can turn against us with no warning we are equipped to notice and no villain to blame. Tambora was not punishment. It was not prophecy. It was geology. Indifferent, enormous, and utterly uninterested in whether the rice grew that year. The people of 1816 suffered inside a cause and effect they could not see, and they endured it without ever knowing its name. We can see it now. We can read the ice, track the aerosols, model the veil. But there is another Tambora somewhere beneath the earth, on some quiet mountain with a village on its slopes waiting. And when it comes, the frost will fall on a June morning, and for all our instruments, some farmer somewhere will still walk out to a ruined field and feel, for one moment, exactly what that man in Vermont felt, that the world had changed overnight, and that no one had told him why.